Now that we have our laser set up, let's go ahead and open up our player script and talk about how we can actually spawn this into the game when we hit the space key or when you hit the left mouse click. So already, just by saying when we hit the space key or when we hit the left mouse click, you should already know what the pseudocode for something like that would look like. For example, what are we trying to do, right? So we can hop down into our update method here, right below our movement code, and we can write out simple if statements. What do we want to do if you hit the space key? If space key, right? So if space key pressed, then what do we want to do? If space key is pressed, we want to create an object. So we want to say spawn laser at player position, right? Now the question then becomes, how do we spawn a laser? Also, how do we get keyboard inputs? So in previous videos, we looked at horizontal input and vertical input, right? Well, there are ways to get button presses and keyboard and mouse clicks through the input manager as well. And these are called key codes. So I want to go ahead and show you what those look like. So for instance, say we want to do, every time we hit the space key, we want to fire off a laser, right? So let's start filling this in. So if we hit the space key, so we have our if statement, and then in order to get a key code, we use the input manager, so input, and then we say .get key. And you have three options here. You can get key, which means you're holding that key down. So it returns true while the user holds down the key identified by name. So you can think auto fire. Get key down, which is when you press it down. And then you have get key up, which is when you lift your finger off that key. So what we're going to be doing is every time you press the key down, and then you open up a parenthesis, and you can see here it's saying key code key returns true during the frame the user starts pressing down that key. So we type key code and then dot, and you have every key that's on your keyboard. So if I wanted the space key, if I wanted the A key, I can do A. I could do the Q key, so by typing Q, and I could do even the space key by typing space. So what I'm doing here is I'm checking for the space key. So if I hit the space key, then what do I want to do? I want to spawn my laser. So creating user inputs off your keyboard is super simple. You just have to know the key code that you want, and you're more than welcome to just search for it through this list. Type it out, start searching for it, anything you want. Okay, so what we have here is if we hit the space key. Now let's actually look at how to spawn this laser in. So the first thing you want to do when you don't know how to do something, guys, is just fire up a web browser and let's Google the question. How to spawn an object in Unity. And you'll find here object spawning on the Unity manual. And as we can see here in Unity, creating new game objects with Instantiate. So we use this method called Instantiate, is sometimes called spawning. Now, you can continue reading this and you'll get information about it, but what I want you to do from there is we know that we have to use this method, but what is that method? So let's head over to the scripting API and type in Instantiate. When we do that, you'll see here object.instantiate clones the object original and returns the clone. And you should see here that clones the object original. Well, that's our prefab. We created a prefab of our laser, which is the object original. So let's look at this instantiate method. You have an original object, so here's the parameters that it takes. So like every time you type it out and you open up a parenthesis, you have multiple parameters. So an existing object that you want to make a copy of, that's our laser prefab, the position to spawn the object, the rotation to give the object, you can give the object a parent, and then you can choose to instantiate the object in world space. We'll get more into world space and local space later in the course. Alrighty, so the description reads, clones the object original and returns the clone. So this function makes a copy of an object and instantiates it in our scene. So what's important now is how do we use this? So let's look at their code example. Instantiates 10 copies of prefab, each 2 units apart from each other. Now don't get caught up in all the syntax and everything they're doing. All that's important for us to know is the syntax right here. We just want to know that, okay, we type instantiate and then open parenthesis. Also notice that the first parameter is the object you want to clone, so the original object. So what is that? That's this prefab here. And you can see here that they're using public transform prefab, which holds that object. And I'll talk a bit about using transform versus game object in just a minute here. So let's hop back into our code and set this up. So before we can do anything spawning a laser, we need an object that we're going to spawn. So let's create a game object variable that's going to hold our laser. So right up here, we're going to go ahead and say public game object, and we'll go ahead and say laser prefab. Go ahead and save this and hop back over to Unity. And if you click on your player, you'll see you now have a field where you can actually drag an object. So here it's looking for a none game object. That game object is our laser. So it's looking for a prefab. Drop your laser in there, save your scene, head back into your script. Now we have an object that we're going to spawn. We're going to spawn the laser prefab. So here, spawn my laser, we know that we use the keyword instantiate. So here, when you type instantiate, it says clones the object original and returns the clone. And you can see here the syntax for it is dot, and so we have instantiate, open a parenthesis, and we have 10 options. Let's start small. Let's just use the first one, the object original, which is our laser prefab. Now, you may be wondering, why are we using a game object variable type when the scripting reference used transform? And that's a great question. Honestly, you can use them interchangeably. Every object in Unity is considered a game object, and every game object has a transform. There's no difference. A transform is just a game object. So whether you want to use transform or game object, the principle is still the same, and it would work just as well. Just my personal preference is always to use game objects when I'm instantiating things. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and test this out. So when I hit the space key, we're going to instantiate the laser prefab. So head back to Unity. Let's run the game. And every time I hit the space key, I'm instantiating a laser. Now you can't see it, but if you look in the hierarchy, I'm creating a dozen lasers. Now if I move my player, there's all my lasers. They're lined up, stacked on top of each other. So this is where we're going to get into adding a position and rotation for our laser. So what I want to do is I want to instantiate the laser above my player. So right now it's being instantiated at 0, 0, 0. And the reason for that is because it grabs the value here, 0, 0, 0, from the object original. So to get the value that I want to spawn it at, this is where that value from the last video comes in. I need to set it at 0.88 above the player's center position. So I want to be able to spawn it right here. So let's go ahead and test this out. Let's figure out how we would do that. If we look at the options with instantiate, we have 10 options. We have the object original to spawn, which just spawns the object. We can give the object a parent. We can choose to instantiate it into world space, which we'll get into later. And then here I can instantiate an object, I can specify a position, and I can specify a quaternion rotation. Quaternions is how Unity handles rotational inputs. So here, the object to spawn is our laser prefab. The position, I want to spawn it at my player's position. So let's go ahead and say transform.position for the player. Because remember, when we type transform, we're getting the object that this script is attached to, which is the player. So here, we're instantiating the laser prefab at the position of the player, and I don't want to change the rotation. I don't want to touch it. So in order to do that, we say quaternion.identity, and that just means no rotation or default rotation. Close it up with a parenthesis and save, and let's go ahead and test this out. Now when we run the game, every time you hit the space key, we're going to create a laser, and it's going to be at the player's position. So that doesn't fix our problem, though, about wanting to instantiate it above the player about 0.88 on the Y. So how can we go about doing that? Well, here's our position. What we could do is add 0.88 on the Y to this position. So to do that, we would simply come in here and we would say plus new vector 3, because it's a position variable. So we're going to add a vector to another vector. So my transform.position, assuming it's at 0, 0, 0, 0 for the x, y, and z, I'm going to say new vector 3. I want to add a laser at 0 on the x. 0.88F on the Y, and 0 on the Z. Let's go ahead and save that, and now let's check out where our laser spawns. I hit the space key, and there we go. That's exactly where I want my laser to spawn. As you can see, it's spawning properly every time. Okay, so now that we have our lasers spawning properly, let's get them moving forward. This is where we're going to go ahead and create the laser behavior. I'll see you guys in the next video.